What's up, y'all? Welcome to a History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers podcast from Grind City Media. We are coming to you live in the Built for Tough studio here in Memphis, Tennessee. I am Lang Whitaker, and I'm with my friend Russ Bankston, and we are talking about Russ's new book, The History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers, which is out now, and we are working our way through this book. We've done, the Converse All-Star, we've done the Adidas Superstar, and now we're sort of contemporaneous with the Adidas Superstar, like around the same time.
Yeah, a little bit later.
The Puma Clyde is your third sneaker in the book. And we have one somewhere around here.
Way over your head.
Way over my head. I'll grab it in a second.
Yeah.
We have the Puma Clyde. Where do we start with this? Like, how much of this shoe to me is as much about like the style of it and the style of the time as it is about the actual like shoe.
Yeah, I think I think that's why I wanted to get into that, because I look at the Superstar and the Clyde as kind of two sides of a coin, where it's like, the Superstar is more the pure performance, like we want to convince guys to wear it by how good it is.
Yeah. And
the Clyde, and
here,
I mean the ultimate version of it is still the suede one.
Yeah.
The leather is similar to the basket, although I think if you held this next to a Puma basket, which is their leather shoe, the Clyde didn't like.
Yeah.
This is a little lower profile. The lacing is wider. Just the way it fits is a little bit different, and you could talk signature shoes, and it's like, yeah, well, this has it's hard to see. You can sort of see it. His actual signature on the shoe.
His nickname.
Yeah, and it's like, it's funny, like, talking to Clyde about this shoe, because I think Clyde's been talking about it now for like 50 years.
Yeah.
So, like, he has his patter very down pat.
He was styling and profiling.
Well, yeah, and like, I mean, obviously, yeah, you listen to Clyde and you watch Clyde, like, like, style is like such a big thing for him. But it's like, he talked about like Puma presented him with this deal, and he knew about the basket and tried it and was like, this isn't me. Like, and they're like, no, like, we want you to help us design this shoe. Yeah. So, he ends up doing this suede low cut that they end up doing in like a billion different colors.
Yeah.
On fairly short notice. His Knicks teammates asked him for pairs.
Yeah.
Once he had them, and not to wear on the court. I don't think anyone else ever wore Clydes like with him.
Games.
But they just wanted him to like wear out, and just wear as like street shoes.
To back up a little bit.
Yeah, I jumped.
But we talked in the previous show about Adidas and Puma and this sort of shared history they have coming from Germany and the Dassler family. And Adi Dassler started Adidas, but it was Rudy Dassler who kind of ran Puma at the time, right?
Yeah.
And you talk in your book about how Puma's whole thing back then was sort of trying to get the most interesting people and the biggest personalities to represent their brand.
Yeah, and I mean, Adidas obviously had guys too. I mean, Adidas had Abdul-Jabbar wearing their stuff. They had Muhammad Ali wearing their boots. They even started with Adi making spikes for Jesse Owens.
Yeah.
But Puma, Puma, first of all, they were going to be called Ruda at first because of Rudy, and thank God they changed that.
Yeah.
But they signed Reggie Jackson.
Yeah.
And they signed Joe Namath.
Yeah.
So they had like the two
biggest New York stars.
In baseball and in football.
And in the Olympics was the '68 Olympics in Mexico, like the John Carlos, Tommy Smith thing. Like this famous photo, you have it in the book, of them on the podium after winning in the black glove in the hand. There's Pumas on the stand there.
on the podium with them
that they had worn in the Olympics. But Puma was very focused on as much as, I guess, performance, personalities, it seems.
Yeah, and like, Puma and Adidas obviously were competitive. I mean, as siblings will be, and that '68 Olympics, they're like kind of chasing around track athletes with cash and like paying them to do things. And like, you had guys wearing one brand in a preliminary heat and then another brand in the final, or like, trying to double up, I guess. You had guys with shoes getting detained, like, I mean, just a whole mess.
Yeah.
And in the World Cup too, they're going after soccer players, and like, both Puma and Adidas being German companies, track and field and soccer are the two big things. And they kind of had a gentleman's agreement to not sign Pele.
Yeah, that seems like the worst idea ever for a company. Like, hey, we're not going to sign the best player in the world.
It's certainly, I guess, like,
maybe they didn't want to drive the price up on it or something.
They realized it would be super expensive.
Yeah.
But, Puma hired like this ex-soccer writer to sign guys.
Yeah.
And he's signing other guys on Brazil.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're Pele, obviously, I guess they didn't discuss this with him beforehand because I mean, I think the ideal thing would have been like, you can't not pay him anything when he's the best player. They probably both should have agreed to give him X amount of money and be like, dude, wear whatever you want. Here's a check. But he sees these Puma deals flying around and is like, hey, what about Pele over here? Yeah. And, I don't know what the thought process was, but I'm sure like someone at Puma was like, well, if he's asking for it, we got to give it to him.
Might as well.
So they end up signing Pele too. So, between Pele, Namath, and Reggie, you have those three guys. The only problem with that is all three guys wear cleats.
Yeah.
It's harder to turn around and sell that stuff to a casual wearer.
Yeah, to people who don't play sports. And
I think like, did you play soccer growing up?
Yeah.
Do you remember what your first cleats were?
No.
Like, I forget whether this was soccer
probably like plastic Adidas
or like Little League.
Yeah.
I had a pair of Brooks Roger Dodgers.
Nice. Roger Dodgers.
Roger Staubach cleats. So like I wasn't playing football, but I needed cleats. I did like Roger Staubach.
You could outrun the Packers defensive ends. So.
I think the soles fell off. They were probably glued on. But again, like, how many cleats are you selling to people?
Yeah.
And, can you do like a Reggie Jackson? Yeah. And look, I love Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson follows me on Twitter. I'm honored by it.
He doesn't think you're too negative on it?
It probably does. But I don't know if they ever sold like a Reggie Jackson casual shoe.
Yeah.
There have been like some various Joe Namath
That's
ones.
like the issue. I mean, but that's been the issue until today. Like even like the greatest baseball players of all time can't sell sneakers because they wear cleats.
Right.
I mean, Ken Griffey Jr. comes to mind. Dion had a cross.
You had a couple
shoe.
guys.
Yeah,
in
very
like the
few
90s,
though.
yeah.
But even like Ohtani now, like there's not an Ohtani shoe that people can buy and wear.
And even in soccer, it's like, is there a Leo Messi Adidas that's really viable?
Yeah.
I actually saw a pair of Leo Messi cleats one day in like Burlington, but they were like a size 6.
But even like Beckham never sold like a running shoe. You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, they did a couple.
They
things
tried,
like
but
about
it didn't
him
work.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
The DB.
You would think even
things.
between Messi, Ronaldo, like the current guys, like somebody would be able to cross over out of the cleat world, but they haven't.
But I mean, so to go back to that late 60s, early 70s, it's like you had the Jets.
Yeah.
Well, Reggie wasn't even in New York yet. He was
Oakland.
in Oakland, yeah. But the Jets, the Mets, the Knicks were all like playing at that championship level. And Clyde was, he wasn't even he was the 1A player on the Knicks with Willis.
Reed,
obviously emerged in that finals.
Yeah.
When he had a stat line he remembers perfectly, even including stats they didn't keep back then. The 36.17 assist game.
I'd remember it too.
In Game 7.
Yeah.
And he told it as like, his job was to look for the open man. In the end, he was the open man. Like, you have the ball. But Clyde was a guy who, if they came out with the right shoe and in the right market in New York, they could sell an awful lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, he was a dynamic point guard who was known. I mean, his name was Clyde because of his off-court style and the way he dressed and, the way he carried himself, all that stuff. So Clyde was – Walt Frazier was his name, but Clyde was what he was called because he was so cool. And the fact that, like, if Puma's looking to tap into whoever is, like, the coolest – personality-wise guy in a major market who plays a relatable position, a point guard, all that stuff. Like Clyde Frazier is really like your guy to go to.
And at that point too, I think nowadays we get caught up in the whole like, small market, big market, and I think it matters less now because everything is kind of everyone has their
world's
own
flat
thing.
now. Yeah,
social media or like whatever, like people can go places.
Yeah,
but back then it's like, Madison Avenue advertising is called that because it was on Madison Avenue, and that's where Clyde was. Like, you had the media was centered there, advertising was centered there. Puma's like whole distributorship there was in Yonkers. He could literally drive from his penthouse apartment to pick up shoes. He talks about, and I think if anyone asks him about Clyde's now, like he'll talk about like that tri-state area, just like New York, Connecticut. I don't even remember what the third state is. Jersey, I guess. Yeah. They sold so much there, it didn't even matter. Like the rest of and since the shoes were suede, and you're selling them to kids, and they're wearing them like
in rain,
outdoors. I mean, they were more expensive, but you would also wreck them if you wore them a lot. I remember like back when I first got Pumas, and this was obviously, I'm not that old, but probably in the 80s or 90s. I mean, I definitely remember the soles like wearing down fast. Like,
well, they cost $25. The Clydes did at the time,
which was a lot of money.
Yeah, that in your book you told me that was double what Converse cost or Pro-Keds cost at the time. But they look so cool. Like, I also like looking at the shoe, like how low the whole thing sits. Like, it feels like you're closer to the ground. Like, because Converse All-Stars, those shoes like had thick soles on the bottom, and like this is like getting you closer to the ground. And probably if you're a player like Clyde Frazier, it makes you feel a little more responsive and quicker and all those things too.
And it stood out because, like, I mean, obviously Clyde would stand out on his own.
Yeah.
But like seeing especially like the suede version of this shoe, like in orange, or in blue with orange, it's like that would pop so much.
And if you're a Mets fan,
everyone else wearing Chucks.
You wear the blue with the orange,
and you would want like all the different colors. I mean, you look back at like ads for Puma Clydes back then, and it's like there was green, there was turquoise, there was brown, colors you wouldn't even associate with sneakers back then. And I think like, Bobbito talks about it in his book, which focuses on New York sneaker culture, where it's like people would look for those weird flavors. Like you don't want the one that's like sitting prominent on the shelf. Like you want the stuff that like no one else can find. Baby blue.
Yeah. You talked about how like, or David Stern actually, in your book, you quote David Stern talking about how like Clyde really sort of connected the Knicks to the city in a way that like hadn't really been done in a lot of places. I think like, New Yorkers felt a kinship to Clyde, with the style, the way he played. Like he talks in his autobiography about like staying out all night. Like he was like pretty open to talk about like going out and partying and all this stuff.
I mean, the funny thing to me is like, so, they win the first championship in 1970, and by 1973 they add Earl Monroe.
Yeah.
And they were known as the Rolls-Royce backcourt. And it's like, that was partially tongue in cheek because like they were both expensive and very good. But it was also literal because they both had Rolls Royces, like way before.
There's a story in like if you go in the New Yorker archives, there's a story from some point in this. It must be in the early 70s. Woody Allen wrote a profile of Clyde Frazier for the New Yorker.
I don't think I actually saw that.
And it's crazy. And he goes to like Clyde Frazier lives in a townhouse on like the Upper West Side.
Yeah.
And Woody Allen goes to his townhouse and like hangs out with him for the day. But like it all feels like it's almost like this word salad of like just things from the 70s that mattered. Disco and Rolls Royces and all this stuff.
I mean,
and somehow it all sort of coalesced in Clyde and these shoes.
And one of the things that helped me a lot, like, well, two things. It was like newspapers.com, which literally allows you to access the entire history of like hundreds of different newspapers.
What are newspapers?
From all over the country. It's the thing you wrap fish in.
The thing we both started in.
But also Times Machine, which is like the New York Times archives. And like, like you would find like these huge, long articles on Clyde that only obliquely touched on basketball. Like the one, like it actually literally gave his address, which is kind of funny, like where on 57th Street or whatever his penthouse was, but like how much his penthouse cost, and his mirrored ceiling with Clyde painted on it, and like circular bed. Like he had a lot of the sort of the Wilt Chamberlain accoutrements.
Yeah.
But Wilt, I think the difference was like Wilt had this house way up in the Hollywood Hills that he had custom built for him and was kind of like almost a god on Olympus.
Yeah.
But Clyde like is in the middle of New York City.
Yeah.
And is going out and like stopping in bars and like, I mean, I'm guessing Clyde probably hasn't paid for a drink in New York since 1970.
Yeah.
If not earlier.
Yeah.
So like, like you would see him out and about. I think there's photos of him in his book, like taking the subway to games.
Yeah,
on
the Upper West Side, it's 30 blocks from the Garden. Like, it's not far. You know, he was just right up the street. I circled in here, there was a quote from Clyde about the shoes and how he liked to kind of personalize them.
Yeah.
And he said, like, when he used to wear Chucks, he said, I used to jazz my sneakers up with a blue lace and an orange lace. The thick ones, the thick laces, just a way to add a little pizzazz.
I think he called them, at one point, I think he called them strings too. It's funny, like before I spoke to him, I listened to, he had been on like the Complex podcast talking about a lot of the same stuff. And like, because I was covering the same territory, I probably asked similar questions and he would almost give like word for word answers. It's like he had these answers like already waiting, like just to be downloaded into his brain.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Clyde was he was a predecessor to a lot.
Yeah.
It's like, he's a guy who really had like kind of ABA style despite being an NBA player.
Yeah. And going forward, like to wrap this up, like I think Puma after Clyde, like sort of fell off a bit, I guess. Like, I mean, not in basketball, at least.
Yeah. They had kind of a spotty basketball history. Like you go back and it's like they would try something and it would kind of fall apart, and then they'd be gone for a while, and then they'd try something else. Like, they signed George McGinnis, who was like a big deal. Apparently his shoes tore like the first game he played, which is generally a bad look. And you can jump through, like they had like Ralph Sampson was one of their big guys.
I remember that.
Cedric Ceballos.
Yeah.
He had a disc basketball shoe, which
the ones that like self-tighten.
Talk about that later. Like, trying to replace laces, which like they work. Like that's like trying to replace water.
Yeah.
Vince Carter was a huge signing for them, and it was over within a year.
Yeah.
Or less than a year. So
DeMarcus Cousins more recently. They had like some of those guys recently. Now the LaMelo Ball.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like now you're finally getting to a point where Puma, I think, has kind of found a lane where between LaMelo Ball.
I think they have Scoot Henderson.
Scoot. They had DeAndre Ayton. I'm not sure if some of those guys are still wearing it.
My son's 10 years old, and like he bought a pair of Puma LaMelo Ball shoes recently. Like he saw them, and he, like kids love LaMelo Ball.
Well, that, and I think like one of their bigger athletes, and she was recently named WNBA MVP again, Breanna Stewart. Her shoe, I think, has kind of been a big deal, and like, unfortunately, I feel like women's signature models have been kind of underserved, and
we'll get to that.
Get to that. Yeah, but I think Breanna has been a huge thing. But it's kind of funny, like when Puma came back.
Yeah.
Before LaMelo, I think that was the DeAndre Ayton draft. I forget who else they had.
Yeah.
But when they brought back a basketball shoe, they called it the Clyde.
Yeah. I mean, that's always going to be, I think, for Puma. Like that's. For lack of a better term, that's their Jordan.
It's their heritage.
Yeah, it's their guy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that takes us through the beginning of the 70s, and we're going to keep marching through until we get up to today and into the future. But you're watching or listening to the History of Basketball podcast from Grind City Media. He's Russ, History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers, not History of Basketball podcast, because that's the name of Russ's book. He's Russ Banks, and I'm Lang Whitaker. And we'll be back soon with Chapter 5. Thanks for listening.
If you're looking for even more sneaker culture content, check out The Sneak Fest Show with me, Kelsey Ray Johnson, Sherman, Adam, and Jerry, live every Tuesday at 2 p.m. on Grind City Media YouTube and the brand new Grind City Media app.